So my mother had 9 of us in a city called Kumba in the southwest province of the Republic of Cameroon. My mother was a small trader. My father too was also another small trader. And they were doing everything possible to make sure that they take care of the 9 children. Then, I had passed primary 7, and I was invited to return to Nigeria for my secondary school education because we couldn't afford Saseboya, one of the most interesting secondary schools in Cameroon. When I got to the village where I was to join the secondary school in that small town called Ebuoma. When I got to the school, I didn't like what I saw. I didn't like the environment. It was just not the type of school I would love to go to. And so I made a suggestion that I should go join my elder sister in a village called Omogoma here in Owerri, and even repeat primary 6. That's after completing primary 7. So that I would have a chance to go for the type of secondary school that was just in my heart. And then I had finished primary 6 again. And after that, I decided to apply for model schools here in Owerri. Of course, I chose Government Secondary School Owerri as my first choice. As God would have it, I made it. I made it to Government Secondary School Owerri. I will never forget that day when my mother accompanied me to Government Secondary School Owerri, and another gentleman who decided to join us from the village. My mom was decked in her gold. You could imagine the pride of a mother. I walked into that school. The interesting thing that you need to know, everybody, at least majority of those who went through Government Secondary School Owerri were from very privileged backgrounds. Many of them middle-class families. So I was in the middle of an institution where you would say I was one of the poorest. You can never imagine. But I found out that as a child, I had always believed that Linus Okore is a special breed. I've always had that in mind. So I refused to be poor. In my mind, I was one of the richest kids you could ever imagine. In my thoughts, my father was the richest. And so that reflected in my attitude, which meant I never begged anybody for anything. I began to think in the context of what could I do to gain relevance in Government Secondary School Owerri. And so, by the time I was already in JSS 3, that tragedy happened. I lost my father. My father was no more. My mom was now left alone to deal with 9 children. From that day, I made up my mind that I will no longer disturb my mother for anything called finance. As a year 3 student, that the future that I'd envisioned was already in my hand, that I would succeed. From that day, I began to desire secretly in my heart that I will one day become senior prefect of government secondary school Owerri. That desire was in my heart every day. I was thinking about it. And that day came when every person was seated in my class. And I came in front of everyone and I said to them, "Good afternoon, fellow students. May I announce to you that I will become your senior prefect. Thank you very much." And the whole place was quiet. And then suddenly, the laughter hit on. Everyone began to laugh at me. It was cunning. I felt like the ground should open, so I would enter. The ground refused to open. Thank God for my locker. I ran back to my locker in shame. Who sent me? But as my mind was peeping into the future, I saw myself being decorated as head boy. It was such a beautiful experience. I started understanding mind leadership later, that was what happened to me. Well, few years after, by the time I was in SS2, it will interest you to know that I actually became senior prefect. That was a beautiful experience. That was when it dawned on me that, hey, dreams can come true. Let's fast forward a little bit. Just October last year, the federal government of Nigeria recognized me with a member of the Federal Republic. Just last few months, we have just been given 5 hectares of land to set up the most comprehensive leadership university in the whole of West Africa. Many years after, I traveled the world, sat under some of the best names, from Brian Tracy to John Maxwell, to Dr. Miles Monroe, to some of the biggest names, Professor John Adair, traveled the world speaking. And having set up in Abuja currently the most comprehensive leadership center in Nigeria, I began to ask myself, how come this boy who was from a very poor home, how come this young boy who couldn't afford a lot of things those days, how come that this young man currently is being celebrated for the work that we have done? Over 300,000 people had gone through our various leadership programs. How come that this young person, and the secret for me is that I found myself. I found myself. I remember the day that I found myself, which will establish my first principle on the 3 phases of the concept of finding you. I found myself that day because I had registered to be part of Word of Faith Bible Institute called WOFB here in Owerri, just before I got into the university. And I could remember that particular course called Understanding Divine Direction. And I came in contact with a book titled Nehemiah. I read that book and I began to cry. I began to shed tears because I couldn't find, in the political space, in our environment, I couldn't find leaders who exhibited such sound leadership values that I saw exhibited by that gentleman that helped him to rebuild his country. It was at that stage I began to cry. I cried for many days. I was just asking God, I need a vision for life. I want to raise leaders for Nigeria. And then it dropped in my soul. Raise leaders for Nigeria and Africa. Guardians of the Nation International was born a few days after at the Commissioner for Finance Residence, a man called Mr. Chudu Onuzo, who was then Imo State Broadcasting Corporation MD or Managing Director or Director General. So I saw him, a man of honor, and I shared my vision with him. As I shared my vision with him, he said, I am in. Let's call it GOTNI, Guardians of the Nation International. Since that day, I never, ever rested. The journey for personal development had started. I began to stretch. I began to move. I began to do anything, anywhere I could find learning experience I wanted to. I began to look for the best of the best in this country. I traveled to Lagos looking for people like Gamaliel Nosodeyes of this world. I traveled. I began to look for board members of institutions just to learn from them. Why haven't just entered Imo State University? It will interest you to know, throughout my 4 years in Imo State University, it was a learning system. It was not just about the course I studied. It was about finding purpose and stretching and ensuring that every day I learned something new. The journey for personal development began for me even when I became the first elected student union government president of Imo State University. I never gave up learning. Everyone who wants to become outstanding beyond the fact that you have found yourself, the next phase for your life must be for you to build a deliberate refinery, a human refinery system that is a learning system in itself, where you become such a learner, perspective learner, a learner for life. Every day of your life, you're stretching to the unknown. It's been many years that I have been on the path of learning. I have seen growth that it has brought to my personal life. And then I can never forget when I now began to move to the next phase. The next phase, self-mastery. Self-mastery, when as a result of personal development, as a result of the investment in my mental state, in my entire life, I realized that excellence became a routine in my system. That place of self-mastery, when you have found yourself, you have developed yourself, you have stretched yourself, you have worked so hard to the point where everything you do, the world begins to take notice of you. When you say something, what you say matters. It's at that point of self-mastery, when you have developed the skills that have become so part of you that the world begins to benefit from. Today, imagine that every person in Africa that is young has found self. Imagine that everyone seated today, you have found you. Imagine if the entire leaders across Africa encourage a system where every young person must develop and actually grow to the point where they can gain self-mastery. What it means literally is that Africa will have leaders who have found themselves, who have developed themselves, and leaders who have gained self-mastery. And then what will happen is that we will live in a system that will begin to think about production and not consumption. We will be in a system where people will be excited to go to work on a Monday morning simply because of the fact that they cannot wait to bring value to the system. We will have a critical mass of people who are highly optimized. Optimization will become part of us. And once optimization is in place, once we have a system of productivity, that has a foundation from a point of leadership knowledge and development, growth will begin to happen to Africa. Africa will become a continent of so much wealth in the real sense of it. No nation can make progress until citizens have found themselves, have developed themselves, and have gained self-mastery. The world is waiting for Africa to arise and make that happen. And I'm committing the next number of years that I'm going to be on this planet Earth to ensure that the world will come to Africa. The world will come to Africa and show us respect, because we must have actually groomed a new generation of leaders that have found themselves, that have developed themselves, they have gained self-mastery in all segments of the economy. That excellence will begin to come out of Africa in such a critical mass that the world will begin to say, let us go to this continent. Having looked at my life, having seen where I have come from, today, it will interest you to know that joining me today in this city, literally, is my mother. The mother that made it happen for me. Today, I took a look at her before coming to this place. And I said to myself, wait a minute. Imagine if I didn't follow my heart to find me, to develop me, and to gain mastery. Would I be able to pay the hospital bills that I have consistently paid for these years, so that she would continue to live for me and for my siblings? As I begin to look at her and get encouraged to see what I can do to make this country work and Africa work. Because there are so many people that were in my condition and state, but because they didn't find themselves, they didn't develop themselves, they haven't gained self-mastery, and they are still where they are, in poverty and in lack. So my question is, would you begin the journey of finding you? Thank you very much.